All right, I think I'm ready to get started now. So, this is the start of the next module. So, just as a reminder, the course is broken up into 4 modules, and each module occupies 4 weeks. And within each module, there are 4 assignments basically. There's one which is the major creative project, there's a worksheet, there's a discussion, and a quiz. So, for this one, the major project, which is what I'm going to talk about in today's class, is there's 3 parts to this project. So there's 3 different pieces of design that you're going to create, but they're all based around the idea of creating illustrative type. And really what I mean by that is type which is created, which is a unique piece of type. So rather than necessarily using a font, you might actually be drawing the type. And that the type in some way illustrates the idea. And so I'm going to have you do these 3 different illustrative designs. One of them will be a greeting card. So it says birthday card here, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a birthday card. It could be like a get well card or something like that, but some kind of a greeting card which has wording on it. So it might be as simple as happy birthday, but you could create you could create more text for it than that if you wanted to. But I then want you to illustrate that idea. And then I'm going to have you do a type poster that illustrates a famous quote. So you can find a particular quote and then illustrate that with type. And then the last one is a postcard that illustrates the name of a city. So, it could be Los Angeles, San Francisco, but a postcard. So instead of it being an image of the city, it will be a piece of type that sort of represents the city in some way. At the bottom of the project, I've put this example here of illustrative type examples, and I'll flick through some of these. So this is an example of a piece of type which uses what's called isometric perspective or isometric projection. Isometric is a form of perspective which is based off of an angle of 30 degrees, and there is no vanishing point. So it's a kind of perspective that's used in either engineering drawing, in fact, that's where it stems from, or it's also used in things like video games. It's a consistent thing, so you can move things around and they will interact with each other seamlessly because they're all following the same angle. So there's lots of examples of isometric illustration. You'll see them if you do a search for isometric illustrations. It's a system that's used a lot. It's a way of somewhat realistically representing 3-dimensional space, but without the difficulties involving having a vanishing point. Because if you draw something in perspective, if you move to the side a little bit, it's out of perspective. Whereas with isometric, that's not true. This is a really beautiful illustration for the word fungi, and obviously illustrates the idea of fungi fairly well. So with something like this, the illustrator that created it may have started with a font and typed out the word and then illustrated over the top of it. This is could well be done in Adobe Illustrator, could possibly do it in Photoshop. But again, it's basically taking the concept of this is says licky. So like it looks like a tongue, which is making up the typography, right? It illustrates the idea, and it also has a sort of fluid quality about it, which I think is really interesting to look at. This is an example of a letter form which is illustrating sort of architectural features, which might be useful to bear in mind when you come to do the city postcard. Some other examples of those same illustration series. This is one that's illustrating the concept of war. This one's interesting because it's using kind of photographic elements of bones to illustrate the idea. So you could use photography in this, in the sense that, illustration, we generally, I think, when people think of the word illustration, they think in terms of drawing. But an illustration could also be, a collage, for instance. It doesn't necessarily have to be something which is drawn. This is a very kind of retro sort of 80s kind of feel to it. probably done in Adobe Illustrator. You can see here it's utilizing patterns like that dot pattern, which you can make very easily in Illustrator, grids. It's using repeated lines. And all of those various aspects of the illustration add to a kind of emotional feel to it. It feels very kind of like poppy and a little bit artificial and joyous in a way. Somebody had used this, and one of the students, I don't remember if it was last semester or the semester before, and did one sort of based off of this style, but for Tokyo. And it really worked for Tokyo, the way that they did it. This is using 3D type. The letters are sort of squashed together. This one is sort of combining an illustration with a piece of type where they kind of overlay and interact with each other. One thing that's is difficult with this project, or one of the traps that people might fall into with this project, is that you do sort of two separate things. One of them is the illustration and one of them is the type, and they're sort of stuck together. And that's not really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the type itself to become kind of an illustration, if you like. This is a good example of, you know, the word bike being illustrated with parts of a bike. Walk being illustrated in that same sort of way. So all three of these would probably be created using a 3D software. Although you might be able to create illustrations similar to this using a combination of Illustrator and Photoshop. Same with this one. This also uses 3D software. So does that one. So does this one. Here it's using objects, to create words. You can see out on this piece of type where the word donuts is made out of something which basically looks like it's donuts, right? And the coffee is made out of coffee. And you get a real sense of the typography illustrating the idea very clearly. This is a piece of type which is done photographically, actually, by using various different vegetables and foods and so on to make up this particular word. So this class is not a software class. So when you're making this type, there's no reason why it couldn't be illustrated by hand and then scanned in. You might even make models or sculptures to illustrate it. You don't necessarily have to use a computer software. I'm going to do some demonstrations in Illustrator and Photoshop for how you could approach making illustrated letter forms, but I would explore other options as well. So here's an example of that same piece of type shown larger. You could, by the way, do something similar to this digitally. So I think with this, they actually photographed it, as you can see here, where they're setting it up. But you could take photographic images of all of these various elements and sort of combine them together in Photoshop and create a shadow underneath it that would do something similar to that. It would be difficult to really achieve quite the same results, but you could get something that gives you that impression. The word heavy represented here quite ironically by something which is very light and can float. This one again is sort of three-dimensional type. Same with this one, land of the free. This one, the typography is actually forming an illustration, right? So you can look through the rest of this yourself. This is a fairly simple one, but again, like that simple shape of the camera and the type sort of squished into there, it becomes one thing, or it becomes one unit that we see that whole thing as one. Same with this one. The type becomes the illustration of the Empire State Building. So with this project as well, what I want you to start off by doing is doing sketches to come up with ideas for how you represent it. And then you'll take those sketches and make them into finished artwork. So like with something like this, it could be that you do it photographically, which I think is what's being done here. Or you could maybe make it in Photoshop, where you fake the idea of it being bits of paper that are folded. How you approach it, how you execute it, to some extent is up to you. And I'm more than willing to help you. So if you show me sketches, like if you put the sketches into the critique, or if you send me a message on Canvas and you say you have this idea and you send me a sketch, but you're not quite sure how you'd go about producing it, I could maybe give you some suggestions on how to approach it. This one is making type out of syrup. Again, this is something that you could do photographically, right? You could make a pancake and you could drip this onto it. It's a little bit difficult to control it, probably. I've never tried doing that, but it might be quite hard to really control it. Whereas you could do this in a program like Photoshop fairly easily and simulate that idea of the syrup over the surface. So here you can see that the idea of the ink and the water mixing is embedded within the typography. So as you can see, there's a variety of different examples here for you to take a look at. And that's really just to give you some kind of inspiration or to give you a clear idea of exactly sort of what I'm looking for. So again, just to recap, you're going to create 3 different designs. One of them is some kind of a card, a greeting card. So it could be a birthday card. It could be maybe like, as we're coming up to Halloween, it could be a Halloween card, maybe something like that. It could be a holiday card. Whatever you want to do, some kind of a card. So this will be 5 by 7 folded. So once it's folded, it'll be 5 by 7. So you'd actually make it 7 by 10 and then fold it in half. So in your Illustrator document, you might want to set it up as 7 by 10. And then you could put a fold in the middle of it, and then the bottom part maybe the design. If you want to, on the back of the card, you could put maybe a logo for a card company, and maybe on the inside you put like a little sentence of just type, which is like a greeting on the inside of the card. As a requirement for the class, you just have to do the front of the card, by the way, the 5 by 7. So if you wanted to extend it and make it into an actual card and maybe even put it in a mock-up so you see it as a card folded, that's up to you. But as far as the requirement is concerned, you just have to do the front of the card. A type poster that illustrates a famous quote. So again, you're going to find a quote and then put it on an 11 by 17 poster. So this would be something that you could try to sell online maybe. So the type needs to be inspirational, perhaps, or find a quote, and then how do you illustrate that with type? A postcard that illustrates the city. So again, like you maybe use isometric for that to type out the word of the city, and then think about how within those letter forms you could have structures that represent that city. This is the basic process. So I want you to begin by making at least 4 sketches for each of the designs. These must be submitted. So those sketches are important because as a requirement for the project, you have to do sketches for it. You may use fonts in terms of creating this, by the way. But to begin with, I want to generate ideas. And so to just generate ideas, I want you to do those as sketches. When you bring them in and start actually producing them, how you produce them depends a little bit on what those sketches look like. Sometimes rather than using a font, you might actually draw it in Illustrator or in Photoshop. Or as I said, make it by hand. But begin with the sketches. Create the designs. This is not a software class, so you can create the posters using whatever software you like. You could even make them by hand or partially by hand. submit JPEG files to the critique project 2, improve the project, submit here for grading. If in Illustrator, you could submit it as an AI file, and if in Photoshop, I want a JPEG and the layered PSD. Aria, you have a question for me?
Yeah, hi. For the
Hey.
sketches, did you want for the sketches to be just sort of our brainstorming process, or do you want them to be a little more refined and narrowed down to exactly what we want, or what stage did you want those sketches in?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the requirement is that you do the sketches. Okay, I don't really grade the sketches on the basis of how good the sketches are. I grade them in terms of you having gone through the process of developing the idea through sketches. Okay, so you'll submit those 4 sketches. Now, having said that, if you want to take your sketches, on some of them, the idea would be to take those sketches and then refine them further into a more finished illustration, which might require actually refining your sketch before you bring it into Illustrator or before you bring it into Photoshop. You might want to refine the sketch a little bit further so it's really useful as a sort of rough drawing to build upon. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But as a
So
requirement for the class, I'm not grading them on the fact that they're refined drawings. I'm really looking for rough sketches which generate ideas.
so even if there's sketches somewhere along the brainstorming phase, not necessarily like a narrowed down idea, or you wanted the idea more narrowed down in the sketch?
So there'll be 4 different sketches, right? Each one of those is developing an idea. Now, I'm giving you a minimum of 4 sketches. If I was doing a project like this, I would do more than 4 sketches for each one of these probably before I got to the point where I really feel like I've developed it. So you might end up doing more sketches than 4 if you're really trying to explore what that could be like, right? But as in terms of the requirement for the grade, you just need to submit 4 sketches for each one of those 3. So there would ultimately be 12 sketches, right? And now
Okay, got it.
how you use those sketches depends a little bit on the ideas that you develop. So the idea that you develop, maybe the one that you choose, really requires you going in and illustrating it in a way which, for you at least, makes more sense for you to just start directly in the software. For somebody else, it might make more sense for them to refine it by hand first before they bring it into the software. But does that answer it? Is that enough?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool. The other thing I should say about the sketches, by the way, you can do your sketches however you like. So you could do your sketches on paper and then photograph them and send me those. Or you could do them digitally. If you have a Wacom tablet or some kind of pressure sensitive tablet that you want to use, you can do them digitally in like a software like Photoshop, for instance, is great for sketching in. Or if you have an iPad or some kind of tablet device, you could use a software like Procreate to sketch in. I don't really mind how you develop the sketches. There are advantages to doing digital sketches if you haven't really done that before, in that it's easier to edit them. You know, you can more easily do a sketch, lower the opacity on that layer, create another layer above it, and then refine that sketch a little bit further. Whereas if you're doing it in pencil, it's a little bit more tricky to refine that. You might have to put a piece of paper over the top on a light box and redraw it again if you want to refine it. Or of course you could do a rough sketch, bring that into Photoshop and then refine it in Photoshop. So you may be using a little bit of both. Whatever works for you best. Okay, so you experiment with what works best for you. Perhaps already know what works best for you in terms of developing ideas through sketches. But I just want you to go through that process. You're then going to submit a JPEG or JPEG files actually for each one of those 3 to the critique for project 2. This should be done at the latest on the Wednesday class of week 8. So I'm going to do the critique, the sort of final critique of the project on the Thursday class of week 8. So I want to have them in before that to do the critique. Having said that, if you can submit them before, we could start critiquing them so you can get feedback on the project. The idea of putting them into this critique, of course, is for you to get feedback on your work so that you can push it further. So I also want you to give feedback to other people in the class, what you think would make that project better. So when you're commenting on it in the critique, don't just say, like, I think that looks cool. Really analyze it and try to figure out what would make that project work better. What could they do to make that project work better? What is it about it that doesn't quite work? Is it a bit imbalanced? Maybe one of the letters doesn't quite read properly or something like that, you know? After it has been critiqued, you would have time to go back and improve the project before you submit it finally for grading. When you submit it, it depends how you produce it as to what files I would want from you. But let's say you did it in Adobe Illustrator, submit it as an Illustrator file. If you did it in Photoshop, I want both a JPEG and a layered Photoshop file. So the layered Photoshop file is a file I can go back and edit. The JPEG file will just show up in Canva so I can see it right away and I don't have to download it to look at it right away. So that's why I'm asking for both of those. It may be that you do it in some other way, like let's say you did it by hand, in which case I'd like to see, like, obviously you're going to have to photograph it perhaps, or scan it and then turn that in. So you're most likely going to be turning in some kind of a Photoshop file or a JPEG, okay? So the end of this week, I would suggest that you have started the sketches. Hopefully you could get them all done by this weekend. And then you can start working on the roughs. By the end of week 6, you should have all of the sketches started on the roughs. And by the end of week 7, you should have the roughs done. By the end of week 8, you should have the 3 finished posters. So this is just a kind of guide in terms of what you should get done by what time, so that you can keep sort of on track of this. Okay, does anybody have questions about any of that so far? All right. So I think what I'll do is, as I'm just introducing this for right now, is I'm going to do a couple of demonstrations. I'll begin in Illustrator for some approaches to working with type. So either illustrating type, I'll talk about creating outlines in Illustrator. So Illustrator is a good program for type for a couple of reasons. It's vector based, which means that type will stay sharp and crisp no matter what size you scale it at. It also gives you a lot of creative possibilities. The way that you can manipulate shapes in Illustrator is very useful for illustration purposes. It also has tools for doing 3D kind of effects and a variety of other stuff. So first of all, you have a variety of type tools in Illustrator that you could work with. Now, this list of type tools is a little bit misleading because these first 3 are replicated with these next 3. So you've got the type tool, the area type tool, and the type on a path tool. The type tool is the tool you'd use the most. The area type tool and the type on the path tool are for specific kind of purposes. And then the next 3 were really designed for the Japanese version of the software and allow you to do vertical type in those 3 contexts. The last one, the touch type tool, allows you to manipulate type by adjusting the space between type, adjusting the baseline, and so on. So let's say we take the word happy birthday. I'll scale it a little bit bigger. So the birthday card, by the way, is going to be 5 by 7, right? So if I wanted to set up a file in Illustrator that was 5 by 7, now it's also folded. So it actually has to be the document setup. If I was creating it ready for print, I would want to make it, I'm going to go to the artboard tool. At the top right now, it's in points. So if like most people, you don't really understand how to think about it in terms of points. If you bring up the rulers, Command R will bring up rulers, and I control click in here, I can change it to inches. Also, when you make a new file, you can change it to inches at that point right here. Okay, so now it's in inches. If I go to the artboard tool and click on that, you can see at the top, this is 8.5 by 11. Now, really, I want the card to be 7 by 10. This is the size of the actual card itself, once it's trimmed to size. If I go to document setup, there's a setting in here for bleed. So this is not a requirement for this particular project, okay, to worry about bleed, but I figure I might as well explain this to you whilst I'm setting this up. If you were designing a card like this, you'd set it up the size it would be once it's trimmed, and then you would add bleed around the outside. The bleed is almost always 0.125 of an inch, which is 1/8 of an inch. And then I'll go ahead and press OK. And you can see that there's a red line now that shows up all the way around the outside. So that's the bleed area. The bleed is for anything which goes to the edge, or sorry, any color that goes to the edge. So let's say my card has a background color. Now, I'd probably only want it on the front. So how would I find the center of this? What I can do is put Smart Guides on, which is Command U. If I have Smart Guides on, Control U, by the way, if you're on a PC, this is also here, View Smart Guides. So if I put my cursor up in the corner here where it says intersect, I can drag across like this until I hit the other side where it says intersect. And then if I drag a guide to fit to the center of this rectangle, I now know where the middle of this artwork is. Now, if this was a greeting card, if it was a horizontal greeting card, it would be like this. So this would be the front, this would be the back. Now, you might actually want to have an additional artboard. So if I choose the artboard tool and click here, this could be the inside of the card. So maybe there's a greeting on the inside of the card as well. So maybe this continues onto the inside, you know. All right, so back to working with type in Illustrator. Here are some examples of the things that you can think about in terms of typography. So here we've got the words happy birthday. Happy birthday is in upper and lowercase. If I duplicate that, let's say I go to type and I choose change case and I change it to uppercase, we could have uppercase. So it has a different feel just changing that. We could also change the font, of course. Now for this project, you might well not be working with type. You might be drawing the typography. But if you are working with type, when you're choosing type, the character panel up here in the control bar, or you can go to window, oops, click away. You go all the way down to type, and then you can choose character panel right here. So in the character panel, we have various settings, right? We've gone over this previously. So we've got the size of the type, the leading, the kerning, and the tracking. So one thing to think about is the space between letters, right? How much space do those letters have in between them? If I want to choose a different font, we can go up here and we can choose using filters, right? So we could choose, maybe I only want to look at sans serif typefaces. And we can click to find different sans serif typefaces that we could use for it. And then you have the various families, of course, the different weights of that font. So let me bring this back in a little bit. I feel like it's a little bit too wide. The other thing that's great about Illustrator is that we can do what's called outline type. We can change the type from a font into just drawn objects. So this little context sensitive menu, which is a new feature in Illustrator, you'll notice down here that one of the icons, if I click on it, says outline the text. This is because I have text chosen. This is also a place, by the way, where we could choose a different font and so on. So if I outline this type, now instead of it being associated with the character panel here, these are just drawn objects, right? So that means that we can manipulate the letter forms. We could take a part of the letter form using the direct selection tool, and I can move them. So the direct selection tool in Illustrator is this white arrow. There's also the group selection tool hidden with it, so you might have to click and hold down to find the direct selection tool. The selection tool will always select the entire group. So in this case, it's selecting all of these letters because they're grouped together. The group selection tool will allow you to select an object within the group. Click a second time, you've got that whole group. So here, initially it selects the outside of the letter P. If I click a second time, it's got the whole of the letter P. If I click a third time, I've now got the whole piece of type again. So that's the group selection tool. It allows you to work with objects that are part of a group. The direct selection tool will also allow us, if I select over a part of the letter form, you'll notice that it has these corner widgets, so we could round parts of the letter forms as well. You could also use the direct selection tool as a way to manipulate the letter forms in other ways. So like here, for instance, if I nudge that part of it down, so I'm selecting over it with the direct selection tool. So all of these anchor points are selected, but these are not. And this would allow me to move this into a different position. It would also allow me, once I've outlined the type, to manipulate things like the counter. So here, I could delete the counter altogether maybe, or I could move it into a different position. So here, what should we do? I'm going to take this anchor point right here and this anchor point right here, and I'm just going to move it up a little bit. Let's move that one up a little bit further. Let's take this one, bring it down. Let's leave that one for now. And then I'm going to take this point and bring it down, and I'll round this off a little bit. So we can also move them around. If you're doing this tool right here, so hidden with the type tool, remember, you got this touch type tool. This tool will allow you to move individual letters whilst it's still editable type. So I could drag this one up there, for instance. With the letter P, I could move this further over, or I could move it back that way. You could also notice that there's a little circle above here. So I could also rotate the letter forms here. Maybe bring that one a little bit closer, maybe move that one up, maybe move this one here and rotate it. We can also scale the letter forms either proportionally or disproportionately. So if I drag it this way, it's scaling it proportionally. And if I drag it this way, I could squash it or stretch it. I personally don't find that tool to be particularly useful. I find it a little bit gimmicky, to be honest with you, but I thought I'd point it out because you might find it useful. I generally would, for doing this kind of thing, would prefer to work with outline mode, where I take it and convert it into something which is drawn, because it gives me more control. So what I'm trying to do to illustrate the idea of a happy birthday is just to create the type to have a more joyful feel. So some of that is a kind of rhythmical aspect to it. One of the elements of design is rhythm. So we generally think of rhythm in terms of music, but rhythm is also something that we get in the visual arts as well. Now, if I wanted to take letter forms and make them three-dimensional, we could also do that. So let's take the letter B, for instance. I'm going to ungroup all this by doing Shift Command G or Shift Control G if you work on a PC. You forget the keyboard shortcut, it's under Object. So there's Group and Ungroup. Shift Command G was the keyboard shortcut I just did. So if I take this letter B, for instance, I'm actually going to make it gray because it'll work better in the 3D effects. And then I'm going to go to Effects, 3D and Materials, 3D Classic, Extrude and Bevel Classic. Now you can see I've got a 3D version of it. Down at the bottom here, we have isometric. Remember, isometric is that process that I'd shown you, which is sort of like perspective. It's a form of perspective, but there isn't a vanishing point. So you can see here, the perspective is set to 0. If it wasn't set to 0, it wouldn't be isometric. And then we can adjust how far this extrudes back. So maybe bring this in a little bit. I'm going to make this, say, 7. So it'll be relatively small. And then you can choose options under here for how it's lit. So you could light it differently on different surfaces. You could change the color of the lighting. So right now the shading is in black, but you could change that. You could also have it be a wireframe, or you could have it have no shading, or you could have it have diffuse shading, or you could have it plastic shading. And then I'll go ahead and press OK. So in Illustrator, this is what's referred to as an appearance. If we look at it in outline mode, which is Command Y or Control Y on a PC, you can see that the actual shape itself is still just the letter B. The 3D effect is sitting over the top of that as an appearance. Anything which is an appearance in Illustrator, you can expand by going to Object, Expand Appearance. Now this is just drawn shapes again. So that way, if I wanted to create something which is more of an illustration of this, I could select this whole section right here. You can see this is made up of lots of little rectangles, really. It gives the impression of a gradient, but if you look at it carefully, it's actually just a bunch of different shapes. Each one is slightly different gray, and that gives you the impression of a gradient. But I want to make this one shape. So if I go to Pathfinder, Window, Pathfinder, and unite this as one shape, and then combine this with this top shape, I'll unite that as well, so that this is all one shape now. Didn't quite do it for some reason. Try that again. There we go. So let's eyedropper this black and white fill, actually. These two shapes are not quite combined, so I'll unite that as one shape. I'll select this bottom part here. If I double click with the group selection tool, remember that the group selection tool selects in steps through the hierarchy of grouping. So this is one object. If I click once, if I click twice, I've got this whole set of grouped objects. So then I can unite them as one shape. And again, I can eyedropper that black-white stroke that we have above it. This in here, this in here, this in here, and this in here are all just simple shapes. So I can just eyedropper that. Now here, actually, I'd probably want to join these shapes here together with this one. So I'm going to hit Unite, and then let's eyedropper that color again. Same with this bit here. So I'm going to select those and this one, unite them, and then eyedropper this color. The stroke looks a little bit weird on the edges here where it connects. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to set the stroke so that the stroke is rounded at the caps. I'm going to set the same stroke width for all of it. It seems like some of it has a different stroke width. And then I want it to be on the outside. Now right here, for some reason, I'm not able to set that. So let's select this and see what's going on. So this is 2 point. Let's make it a smaller size, first of all. And then I'm going to have the stroke set right here. It's aligning to the center. So let's just make sure all of those are like that. So this is 1 point. Go to the stroke. Let's make sure it's aligning to the center. It is. Select this one. Stroke aligning to the center. Set it to 1 point. This one actually looks like it's getting cut off to me, and I don't quite understand why. It might be that it's inside of some kind of a mask here. Ah, yes, it is. So let's select that and do Object, Clipping Mask, Release. There we go. So that took it outside of there. So the ones on the inside here, the stroke ends up looking a little bit thick. I'm just going to check to make sure that this is on the inside and then change that also to 1 point. So now we have a three-dimensional version of that letter form. Here's another way that we could do it. So that's using the 3D effects. This is a way that you could do it where we're doing it sort of manually. Now, this isn't exactly isometric, although there is a mathematical way that we could do this isometric. But in simple terms, if I was to shear this, so the shear tool is hidden with the scale tool, and I could drag the letter form down sort of like that. So it's on a bit of an angle. Now, because it's going away from us, it would also be foreshortened. So let me shear this back a little bit, actually, maybe more like that. Okay, so if I duplicate this, something like that, by putting it in the front, we could make this into a 3D shape by just sort of connecting it together. So I could draw a shape. Let's change this to a black and white stroke so you can see this more easily. So those are the two letter forms. You can think of this as the front of the letter form, and this is the back. So if I draw a shape that goes from here, it wants to be where it says anchor point, actually. So anchor point to anchor point. I'd go across to here, where it intersects with the anchor point at the top. And then I would follow this around. So we follow this curve to create this front section. Here I'd click to end that point, and I can continue around here. I'll click here and go across to there. Now this shape, I don't really need to draw the whole thing because I can just bring this one in front like that. Now this line obviously can't go there as we see it, but it could hide behind there, no problem. On the inside, you could just simply draw like this angle. You'd need to know what that angle was. So if we did it as isometric, it would be 30 degrees. And then this one can go behind that front shape. Again, this doesn't actually need to be totally accurate right there. So this triangular shape, it could actually add a point in the middle here and pull this up. So it's just going behind. So I don't have to worry about trying to match that edge. This part here also, I would need that same angle. So I'm not doing this totally accurately, but something like this. Again, I can send that behind the letter B, so I don't have to worry about it matching up exactly. And we would have another one right here. So again, this can go almost anywhere there, actually, as long as that angle is correct. And then I can send this behind the letter B like that. And then on the front end, I would connect from this point across to this point, draw up here. Across here, and then back down around here. Here, actually, I can go straight across, and we can send it back behind that. This needs to actually come a little bit further down, so I'm going to add a point, bring this down to the bottom here, and just curve this out. So that needs a little bit of refining, but we end up with the same result. So it doesn't matter how you approach it, whether you're doing it using the 3D effects or you're doing it using, like sort of manual process. I'll show you one other way that we could create type which is in perspective. There is a tool in Illustrator which a lot of people come across by mistake, which is this one. It's the perspective grid tool. And then once you've turned it on, you can't turn it off again. So if you do turn this on by mistake when you're in Illustrator and you need to turn it off, the way you would do it is go to View, Perspective Grid, Hide Grid. Shift Command I or Shift Control I on a PC is the keyboard shortcut to toggle that on and off. The way that this grid works is that if I was to choose the grid, I can move it, by the way. So here I want to move it over to the next artboard. I'm going to grab this little diamond shape in the bottom left-hand corner, and then I can move this across like that. If I want to change the vanishing point or the eye level or the horizon line and the eye level in perspective is the same thing. So I can move this up and down. If I go down lower, it's like we're lower down looking at it. So remember, perspective is how you're seeing something, from which direction, from which angle. If I go up here, we're looking down further at it because our eye level is higher up. So I'm going to keep this around about here. And then let's take this letter again. And we'll do it one more time. So I'm going to scale it a little bit bigger so you can see this more clearly. So now, if I wanted to put this into perspective, I could use this tool, which is hidden with the perspective grid tool, called the perspective selection tool. And I can simply drag it. Now, up here at the top, we have this thing, which they call a widget. And in this widget, we can choose certain sides. So if I choose the orange side, it's going to use the perspective on this surface. And if I use the blue side, it's going to use the perspective on this surface. So it doesn't matter where it is in the artboard, it's relative to those planes. So for instance, if I drag this into perspective now, you can see that it's going at that angle. I can be over the orange, but it's still following the perspective of this blue surface. Whereas if I was to switch it to orange and drag it into perspective, it's now going at that angle. So again, it doesn't matter whether I'm on the orange or the blue, it's still following the vanishing point over to here. Now, if I wanted to make this have some depth, what I can do now is I can hold the number 5 key and then drag that letter B back like that. Hold Option to duplicate it, and let's send it to back. I'll change this to black and white so you can see that that is behind it now. So now, because we've got that, I could actually just draw a rectangle here, but I want to be on the blue surface. So if I click on that anchor point and drag across, you can see I can finish that like this. Let's try that again. I didn't quite get to the angle right at the bottom. So that's automatically drawing that angle in perspective. On the inside here, we wouldn't really see this part of the letter B. If it was at such an angle that we could see this hole here, you would keep that. But in this case, we can't see that, so I would just delete that altogether. And then we have, again, we've created a 3D B. Now, in this case, it's in perspective, not isometric. That's a big difference. So, if I need to draw another shape, it has to be drawn independently, separately. I am not by any means saying that your type needs to be three-dimensional. I'm just giving you some options for how you can construct stuff. I'll show you another example of what you could do in Illustrator. So like with this letter form, we've already looked at the fact that you could round corners. I could round those two corners by selecting just those 2 points. It's not changing anything else on the letter form. We could also chop letter forms up. So if you use the knife tool, for instance, I could slice into it. So you might want to do that, to make something feel like it's broken or fragmented in some way, So if I put a bunch of cuts all the way through this with the knife tool, all I'm doing is dragging the knife tool across the surface and making all of these cuts across the surface of it, so that eventually I can kind of break that apart, and I can then go in here and we can start fragmenting the letter form as if it's being exploded, Still holding together the form, we still recognize it, but it gives it obviously a completely different feel when we do something like that. Or, you could maybe apply some kind of an effect to it. So if I put these back together, actually, let's keep those as they were. And then I'll do another duplicate of it. So if you go under effects, and then I did distort and transform, pucker and bloat. If I was to put pucker on here a little bit, it would change the shape of these objects. So then it's more fragmented. That was a little bit too much. Let me do that again. Pucker and bloat. Now, when you do pucker and bloat, it's applying it as an appearance. So anything that's an appearance in Illustrator will show up in the appearance panel. So if I want to re-edit that pucker and bloat, I can select this, double click on it, and then I can go in here and I can adjust how much it's doing it. Maybe then I put it back together again so it's a little bit more recognizable as a B. Maybe something like that. You could also take the letter form and I can make it into a guide. So I can do Command 5. Command 5 or Control 5 if you're working on a PC will change that into a guide. My guides were hidden, by the way. So I did Command semicolon or Control semicolon, but everything to do with guides is under View. So you've got View, Guides, Make Guides is Command 5 right there. Unlock guides or lock guides, clear guides, hide guides, show guides, and so on. So now I've drawn that, I could go in here and I could redraw the letter form, just drawing it freehand. So I'm going to use the pencil tool and I'm going to draw this so that the letter form ends up being a kind of slightly wobbly version of my letter form, because I wanted it to be a little bit more hand drawn. Now with the pencil tool, there's some settings that you might want to be aware of. If I double click on it, you can see right now I have it set to smooth. So it's not really picking up all of my detail. If I bring it down to accurate, it'll pick up all of my little wobbles. So I'm going to redraw this. And again, I've got some little wobbly bits going along here. I'm not doing the wobbles on purpose, by the way. This is just, I'm using my trackpad. So this is the best I could do. If I was using the Wacom tablet, I could control how much it's wobbling, maybe a little bit more. But I actually purposefully want it to be kind of a little bit out of control so that it creates a wobbly version of that type. And then these shapes, the counters on the inside of the letter B, right now a shape switcher on top. So I really would like those to be a hole. Like you'll see right now, they're not a hole. So I want to make sure that the outside shape is at the bottom. So I just did Shift Command left bracket. This is Object Arrange and then Center Back, so that I know that these two shapes are on the top. Then if I select all three and do Command 8, Command 8 is Object, Compound Path, Make. I'll turn the guide off for a second. So that's what I end up with that. If I trace it from something which is drawn, we could also take this letter form and we could create a rough version also by using effects. So we could go to effects and then we could go to distort and transform, roughen. And you can see that we can roughen the shape here. If I make the size of this smaller, so maybe 1%, and make the amount of details more, and then also make it smooth rather than corners, we would end up with something quite similar to what I drew here. I'm going to leave it on corner so it's just sort of straight lines, and then we would end up with this version of it. So this is an appearance. If you look at it in outline mode, you can see that it still looks nice and crisp. This is sitting over the top of this. This means it's editable. So again, if it's an appearance, so anything which is under effects here would show up, or pretty much anything as an effect here would show up as an appearance in your appearance panel here. Here it is, roughen. If I double click on it, I can adjust the size of that maybe. So maybe we'll make that a little bit more. And maybe reduce the amount of detail so there's less of them. So we have a very different looking rough letter form that way. Once you're happy with it, remember, you can always expand it by choosing expand appearance. When we expand it, we can then edit the letter form in a variety of different ways. If I use the pen tool, I could add a point. Adding a point would allow me to move that point. I'm adding a point. You'll notice everything I'm doing here is on the pen tool. The shape is selected because when the shape is selected, if I put my cursor over a path, it becomes the add anchor points tool. You'll see that my cursor has a little plus sign next to it right now because I'm hovering underneath a selected path. If I click now, it adds a point to that path. I'm now holding Command Control on a PC, and I can then move that point to a different position. If I put my cursor over an anchor point, instead of becoming the add anchor points tool, it becomes the minus anchor points tool, and I can take a point away. So we can use this as a way to manipulate the shapes in Illustrator like that. Here's another way that we could use the appearance panel to change the look of this letter form. So I'm going to make another duplicate of this one. Right now, this is just a fill. But I'm going to add a stroke around the outside of it. And I'm going to make the stroke white. So if we look in the appearance panel, it has the fill and then it has the stroke. I'm going to drag this and duplicate it. So the outside stroke, this one at the bottom, I want to make it bigger. I also am going to change the color of it. So if I click right here, I can change it to black. And then I'm going to change this to a 2-point stroke. Now we've got a line going around the outside of it. If I duplicate that now and make another one, this time I'm going to make it white, and this one actually needs to go underneath that one. Or we'll just use this one. So this one here, I'm going to make it white, and then I'm going to make it a bigger size. So let's try 3-point. Now you'll notice that it's eating into the fill. If I put the fill at the top, it'll cover up the strokes. And now we only have these strokes on the outside. So this one is 3. If I then duplicate the black and put this one at the bottom, so I'm just dragging it up and down. Here I'm going to make this one 4-point. And you could continue to add additional strokes around and around and around like that to add to the overall look of it. So this is why Illustrator is so good for this kind of creative typography, because it allows you to modify the letter forms in so many different ways. I'll give you another example. So I'm going to start off with a piece of type. I was trying to search for a font called Palatino, but I had it set to sans serif, so that's why it wasn't coming up, I think. Let me try again. How are we doing for time? Oh, it's 4 o'clock. So I've probably done enough for right now. But let me just do this last bit. So right now this is upper and lower, but let's change this to capitals by going to type, change case, uppercase. I'm going to separate these just a little bit. And I'll keep it like that. I'm going to outline my type again. So Shift Command O. Sometimes you might want to connect letter forms together. So here I'm going to connect the R and the D together. At the bottom here, first of all, I'm going to cut some of this off. I'm just going to draw a rectangle over the bottom of the D, and I'm going to use Pathfinder, Window, Pathfinder. And if you haven't used this panel before in Illustrator, this allows you to add shapes, subtract shapes, and divide shapes in a variety of different ways. So here we're going to minus front. This will get rid of that part of the letter form. I'm also going to cut this letter form, the letter R, about here, and again about here. And then I'm going to delete this. Now, if I look at this in outline mode, you'll notice that on this one, it's open, whereas this one, it's closed. And I actually want this one to also be open so that I can connect to it. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to delete this bit right here. So it won't look any different here, but now I can connect to this part of the letter form with the R. So I'm going to take this shape here and I'm going to connect to it. And then I'm going to go down like this, and I'm going to continue across to this point here. Now I can start here and I can continue across and connect right here. Now, I didn't make a very good connection because this is at the wrong angle, but I could take that point out. I could maybe pull this one a little bit further down, maybe take this anchor point out. On this one, I need to figure out what I want to do here. So I think what I'm going to do is pull this one down a little bit, create a little bit of a curve. And then here, I'm going to pull this down and I'm going to curve this. Oops, let's pull that down holding shift so it stays straight. And I'm going to curve using the direct selection tool. I'll curve into there so that this becomes like a curving shape that jags into there. Now this curve here, it's not quite what I'm looking for. I want to pull this bit a little bit further down. And then here, I'm also going to pull this handle right here. I want to pull this one a little bit further down here. So I want to create like a flowing motion from here through to there. So it still isn't quite working. It still needs a bit of refinement. If I click on here again, I'm mainly using the direct selection tool to adjust these. This handle right here, I think needs to come a little tiny, little bit further in. Like this. And then this one probably needs to pull back slightly right there. So it's a matter of like fine tuning those adjustments. I don't want to spend half an hour trying to adjust that correctly, but that might be useful also in the way that you connect one letter form to another letter form as a way to create an effect. Illustrator would also allow you to have parts of a letter form fade out, for instance. So here I could apply a gradient that goes from black to white. I could have just the bottom of that kind of fade out a little bit like that. We could use this as a way to interlock shapes with each other. So like maybe here, for instance, if I was to if I was to cut it from here, I'm going to draw a line that goes into there and then back out. And this wants to be a stroke. I want it to be a stroke so that when it cuts, it just cuts through here, not from the beginning to the end. So I need the R shape selected on that line and then divide it. So now I could have a gradient that goes from here to here and have it fade out maybe like that. Or I could have it fade out going this way. And I could have this one fade out going that way and that way. So we'd cut it again here, 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 and here. Again, this needs to be a stroke with no fill. Then I can cut this shape by using Pathfinder Divide. There'll be a weird empty shape in there that I don't need, but I'll get rid of that. So if I did a gradient here, I can eyedropper that gradient. I'm just going to run it so that the last little bit is fading out. Same here, just that last little bit, kind of like that. So then it starts to feel like they're sort of interlocking with each other in some sort of way. And here I'm doing it as a highlight, but actually if it works as a shadow, it becomes more like if it goes darker there, it becomes more like a shadow. So if my gradient, instead of going from black to white, for instance, went from black to, say, a dark blue, like something like this, and I had it go this way, this part would then become basically like a shadow going into there, and I'm going to eyedropper that same color, and we could have it do the same thing right here where that becomes a shadow going into there. This one could then just basically be that blue. But it feels like then that they're sort of overlapping. The black here is purely black, where it might actually be better if the black has some of that blue in it. So I'd add a little bit more cyan, add a little bit more magenta, and take out the yellow. That way it'd be more blue based, so that it's not just a gray black, it's like more of a blue black, so that it would feel like it fits in there together, I think that'll do for right now. I'll do more demonstrations, obviously, as we go through this project, but that's just to sort of get you started with it. Does anybody have questions for me? Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting at this point. I'll post the video a little bit later. I'm still catching up with grading. I'm up to my neck in freelance work at the moment, so it's a little bit of juggling act going on, but I will get to it as soon as possible if I haven't graded something of yours yet. All right. If there is something that I graded and you're not sure why I graded it a certain way, by all means ask me. And if you need any help, send me a message on Canvas Mail. All right. Talk to you guys later.